Nicholas James Casotis. In December 2022, hunters in Liberty County, Georgia, stumbled upon human remains inside a wooded area near a hunting club that extended into McIntosh County. Investigators with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation later confirmed the remains belonged to 40-year-old Mindy Mabane Casotis. The discovery immediately launched a homicide investigation that drew in both local deputies and state agents. The GBI announced in May 2023 that Mindy's husband, Nicholas James Casotis, a 43-year-old former Navy Judge Advocate General officer, had been arrested in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He was extradited back to Georgia and charged with malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, tampering with evidence, and removal of body parts. According to the charging documents, evidence at the scene showed Mindy had been dismembered, with investigators noting tool marks on the remains. Prosecutors presented testimony that Nicholas tried to cover his tracks by disposing of the body in multiple locations. During pretrial hearings, the state also introduced evidence that Mindy's remains had been deliberately cut apart, underscoring the brutality of the crime. While defense attorneys attempted to suggest that an alleged third party named Jim McIntyre was responsible, prosecutors argued this was a fabrication to deflect from the overwhelming forensic evidence pointing directly to Nicholas. The case went to trial in Liberty County in the summer of 2025. Over several days, jurors heard forensic experts, law enforcement testimony, and evidence of the couple's deteriorating marriage. The courtroom also learned of Nicholas's past legal battles, including a $1.5 million judgment obtained by a previous ex-wife, which prosecutors argued showed a pattern of personal conflict and financial strain. On August 14, 2025, the jury deliberated for just over an hour before returning a unanimous guilty verdict on all 12 counts, including malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, tampering with evidence, and removal of body parts. Judge D.J. Stewart imposed the sentence immediately, ordering Nicholas James Casotis to serve life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 25 years for the related charges. Emmanuel DeWayne Coble. In August 2022, deputies in Hanover County, Virginia, made a grim discovery when they found the body of 20-year-old Rakia King in a ditch off Greenwood and Winds Church Road. Rakia King was about 12 weeks pregnant at the time of her death. Investigators quickly focused on her boyfriend, Navy Lieutenant Junior Grade Emmanuel DeWayne Coble, then 27 years old and stationed in Hampton. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. Prosecutors later revealed in court that Coble had pressured King to get an abortion, but she resisted. On the night of the crime, Coble admitted that he shot her and then transported her body from Hampton to Hanover County, where he abandoned her in the woods. He was additionally charged with the murder of a pregnant woman, the first-degree killing of a fetus, and concealment and transportation of a body. The trial in Hanover County Circuit Court concluded on April 23, 2025. Jurors found Coble guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, use of a firearm, fetal homicide, and concealment of a body. At sentencing on July 18, 2025, Judge John Harris sentenced him to 2 life sentences plus an additional 8 years of prison time, describing him as extremely dangerous, and ruled that he should never be free again. Olatunbosun Ubogu. In March 2008, 61-year-old taxi driver Masayaki Takahashi was working his usual route when he picked up a fare near Tokyo's Shinagawa Station. His passenger was Seaman Olatunbosun Ugbogu, a 23-year-old Nigerian national serving aboard the United States ship Cowpens, stationed at the Yokosuka Naval Base. During the ride, Ugbogu suddenly attacked Takahashi, stabbing him fatally in the neck with a kitchen knife, and Takahashi collapsed inside his cab. Investigators later found Ugbogu's credit card inside the taxi. He was initially detained by U.S. Navy authorities for desertion, but was turned over to Japanese police once his connection to the murder was confirmed. Prosecutors charged him with murder, robbery, and violating the arms control law, alleging that he killed Takahashi to avoid paying the fare and to steal money. At trial in the Yokohama District Court, Ugbogu's defense argued that he heard voices compelling him to kill, presenting this as a claim of mental illness. However, presiding Judge Masaki Kawaguchi and two other judges rejected the claim as groundless. The court determined that Ubogu was mentally competent at the time of the killing and that his actions showed planning and intent. On July 16, 2009, the Yokohama District Court convicted Ubogu of all charges and sentenced him to life in prison with labor. In September 2010, the same court ordered him to pay about 50 million yen, approximately $593,000, in damages to Takahashi's family, recognizing the lasting harm his crime had inflicted. John Eric Armstrong. Armstrong was born in 1973 and later joined the U.S. Navy, serving aboard the aircraft carrier United States ship Nimitz beginning in 1992. During his service, he traveled widely, and later investigators would connect him to murders not only in the United States but also abroad, including in places like Hawaii, Hong Kong, and Thailand. Although he later left the Navy and settled in Detroit, Michigan, by early 2000 police began to uncover a disturbing series of murders targeting sex workers in the Cass Corridor area. On April 10, 2000, authorities discovered the strangled bodies of Wendy Jordan, Monica Johnson, and Kelly Hood near railroad tracks close to Interstate 96. Within days, the bodies of Robin Brown and Rose Marie Felt were also recovered. The women had been strangled, and some of their bodies appeared deliberately posed. Armstrong later admitted that he sometimes placed the victims in positions so he could return and continue sexual acts with their corpses. The shocking part is that he had been committing these crimes while still in the Navy. Investigators linked Armstrong to the murder of Wendy Jordan after DNA evidence confirmed he had been the last person with her. Following his arrest, he confessed to killing women in Michigan and admitted to attacks in several other states and countries. Though he later recanted some of these statements, detectives believed the scope of his crimes extended far beyond Detroit. In March 2001, Armstrong was tried in Wayne County, Michigan. He was convicted of first-degree murder for the deaths of Wendy Jordan, Monica Johnson, and Kelly Hood, and second-degree murder for the deaths of Robin Brown and Rose Marie Felt. On April 5, 2001, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Today, Armstrong remains in prison, remembered as a serial killer who hid behind the image of a disciplined Navy sailor while preying on some of the most vulnerable women he encountered. William Oliver Reese, Jr. In the early morning of January 3, 2006, in Yokosuka, Japan, William Oliver Reese, Jr., a 21-year-old U.S. Navy seaman assigned to the U.S. ship Kitty Hawk, attacked Yoshi Sato, a 56-year-old woman who was on her way to work. According to court findings, Reese had been drinking and demanded Sato's purse, and when she resisted, he dragged her into a building entrance and beat her for nearly 11 minutes, punching, stomping, and throwing her against walls. Yoshi Sato suffered massive internal injuries, including a ruptured kidney, and died soon after at a hospital. Reese then stole about 15,000 yen, roughly $130, from her purse. Japanese police, working with the U.S. Navy under the Status of Forces Agreement, arrested Reese after gate guards at the Yokosuka base noticed blood on his clothes. Reese confessed during questioning, admitting that he assaulted Sato in order to rob her, though he claimed he did not intend to kill her. Prosecutors charged Reese with robbery resulting in death and sought life imprisonment, while Sato's family urged the court to impose the death penalty. On June 2, 2006, the Yokohama District Court convicted Reese, and 2 days later, on June 4, they sentenced him to life in prison with forced labor. Thomas Lewis Garner. Under the bright Florida sun of August 5, 1984, the body of 25-year-old Navy recruit Pamela Cahanes was discovered in the yard of a vacant home in Sanford, Seminole County. She had just graduated from the Orlando Naval Training Center 2 days earlier. Pamela was found brutally beaten, strangled, and partially unclothed, with her belongings scattered nearby. The investigation quickly stalled, and despite multiple leads, the case went cold for more than 3 decades. In March 2019, Seminole County investigators finally broke the silence. Using genetic genealogy, they identified Thomas Lewis Garner, a fellow Navy recruit who had trained alongside Pamela. Detectives retrieved his DNA from discarded items such as cigarette butts and dental floss taken from his trash. That DNA matched evidence collected from under Pamela's fingernails and her underwear in 1984. Garner, who by then was working as a dental hygienist in Jacksonville, was arrested at his home without incident. He denied knowing Pamela and insisted he was not involved. In May 2021, Garner stood trial in Seminole County. Prosecutors argued that the DNA evidence proved premeditation. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder, and on May 6, 2021, the judge sentenced Garner to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the story did not end in Florida. Prosecutors in Honolulu later announced that DNA linked Garner to another unsolved homicide, the 1982 strangulation of 25-year-old Kathy Hicks, whose body was found in a ravine after leaving a Waikiki nightclub. Garner had been stationed in Hawaii with the Navy at that time. In 2021, a Honolulu grand jury indicted him for second-degree murder in Hicks' death. While he awaits those proceedings, investigators continue to question whether Pamela Cahanes was his only victim. Andrew James Givens, Jr. In February 2014, Norfolk police were called to a home on Heatherset Drive after reports that an infant was in distress. Emergency crews transported 5-month-old Gabrielle Givens to Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters, where she later died. The medical examiner determined her death was caused by blunt force trauma to the head, and the case was ruled a homicide. Investigators quickly focused on her father, Andrew James Givens, Jr., a 23-year-old former U.S. Navy sailor who had been discharged in 2011 under other than honorable status. He was arrested and charged with murder in connection to his daughter's death. Prosecutors argued that Gabrielle's injuries were consistent with violent shaking or beating, while defense witnesses, including Gabrielle's mother, described Givens as an attentive and caring father and raised doubts about whether someone else could have been responsible. In August 2015, Givens entered an Alford plea to second-degree murder. By doing so, he did not admit guilt but acknowledged that the Commonwealth had enough evidence to convict him. On November 20, 2015, a Norfolk judge sentenced Andrew Givens to 40 years in prison, suspending 24 years of that term. The result left him with 16 years to serve, followed by 20 years of good behavior conditions once released. Nicholas James Rivet. Nicholas James Rivet was a U.S. Navy sailor stationed at Mayport, Florida. In January 2010, he was living with his girlfriend, Brandy Robb, and their children in a home on Valley Forge Court in Jacksonville. On the night of January 25, 2010, Brandy heard a loud thud upstairs, and when she went to check, Rivet told her that he had been trying to get the children to sleep. But hours later, Rivet called her back upstairs because 2-year-old Eddie Robb, Brandy's son, was unresponsive. The child was rushed to UF Health Jacksonville, where doctors discovered severe head injuries, a fractured skull, brain bleeding, and swelling. Eddie was placed on life support but died 4 days later, on January 29, 2010. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide caused by abusive head trauma. For more than 3 years, everything went on, and no arrest was made. Investigators said the case was slowed by conflicting statements from Rivet and Brandy, as well as the need for additional forensic evidence. Finally, in May 2013, at 35 years old, Rivet was arrested by Jacksonville police and charged with first-degree murder. The case went to trial in June 2015, and after hearing testimony and reviewing evidence, a Duval County jury found Rivet guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Eddie Robb. On September 10, 2015, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dwania Hickerson. In July 2016, Dee Wiggum, a 25-year-old nurse from Shubuta, Mississippi, traveled to the Gulf Coast for the Black Rodeo in Biloxi. That same weekend, 20-year-old Dwania Hickerson, a Navy sailor in training stationed at Keesler Air Force Base, arranged to meet her after the two had communicated online. On the night of July 23rd, Hickerson went with Wiggum to a hotel room in St. Martin, Mississippi, and not long after they arrived, the encounter turned deadly. Hickerson launched a violent attack, stabbing Wiggum 119 times. Investigators later described the stabbing as savage, with most wounds concentrated on her face. Surveillance video showed Hickerson leaving the hotel minutes after the killing, and investigators traced him back to his military base, where he was arrested shortly afterward. Initially indicted for capital murder and robbery, Hickerson faced the possibility of life without parole. The brutality of the crime, combined with the fact that Wiggum was a transgender woman, drew national attention and sparked outrage from advocacy groups who called for accountability. In July 2017, Hickerson appeared in Jackson County Circuit Court and accepted a plea agreement to second-degree murder and robbery. Judge Robert Krebs sentenced him to 40 years for the murder charge, with 35 years to serve and 5 on post-lease supervision. He also received 15 years for the robbery, with 8 to serve and 5 on supervision. The sentences ordered to run consecutively. Matthew Scott Sullivan. In October 2014, Elizabeth Sullivan vanished from her home in San Diego's Liberty Station. She was 32 years old, a mother of 2 young daughters, and married to Navy sailor Matthew Scott Sullivan. At the time, their marriage had been in turmoil. Even neighbors described arguments, and court records revealed incidents of domestic violence earlier that year. Investigators later discovered Elizabeth's blood soaked into the bedroom carpet and subfloor of the Sullivan residence. A knife containing her blood was also found hidden under insulation in the attic. Despite these findings, Elizabeth's body was not located until nearly 2 years later. On October 4, 2016, her remains surfaced in San Diego Bay, less than a mile from her home. The discovery coincided with the very day Matthew Sullivan had scheduled movers to relocate him and his children to the East Coast. By 2018, Matthew Sullivan was living in Delaware when authorities arrested him and returned him to San Diego to face murder charges. Prosecutors argued that he fatally stabbed Elizabeth multiple times inside their home, concealed her body for nearly 2 years, and finally disposed of it in the bay. The defense countered by claiming Elizabeth struggled with self-harm and suggesting that the blood and knife could be explained by earlier incidents. In March 2021, after a lengthy trial, a jury convicted Matthew Sullivan of second-degree murder, and Judge Albert Harutunian III sentenced him to 16 years to life in state prison. John Sipos. In November 1969, 23-year-old Mary Scott was found dead inside her City Heights apartment on 39th Street in San Diego. Investigators found signs of a violent struggle, with the door chain broken and furniture overturned. Evidence at the scene showed that she had been sexually assaulted and killed. For decades, the case remained unsolved, with no suspect identified and no arrests made. But in 2020, cold case detectives revisited the evidence. DNA from the scene was reanalyzed with forensic genealogy, and the results pointed to a former Navy sailor named John Sipos, who by then was living in Schnecksville, Pennsylvania. On October 24, 2020, investigators arrested Sipos at his Pennsylvania home, and he was extradited to San Diego, where prosecutors charged him with the murder of Mary Scott. During the trial, witnesses, original crime scene investigators, and DNA experts testified, while the defense argued there were gaps in the case. On March 25, 2022, a San Diego jury found John Sipos guilty of first-degree murder in Mary Scott's death. The following month, on April 22, 2022, he was sentenced to 7 years to life in prison, which was the maximum penalty allowed under California law, as it stood in 1969. John Sipos did not serve long under that sentence. On September 27, 2023, just a year and a half after his conviction, he died while in custody. Craig R. Becker. In October 2015, 32-year-old Johanna Hovebecker fell from the 7th-floor window of her apartment in Mons, Belgium. At first, it appeared to be a tragic accident, but years later, her husband, Lieutenant Craig Becker of the U.S. Navy, would be convicted of her murder. Their relationship had a troubled past. In August 2013, Johanna reported that Craig physically assaulted and strangled her during a hotel stay. She also claimed he had taken her identification and changed her passwords. Later that same day, however, she recanted, saying her earlier statements were the result of medication or confusion, and that case was closed by June 2014. On the night of Johanna's death, prosecutors later argued that Craig gave her a combination of tramadol, zolpidem, and midazolam to sedate her. Witnesses testified that Johanna screamed, clung to the window ledge, and struggled before falling. Craig, on the other hand, told investigators he only heard an initial scream and arrived just in time to see her fall. Belgian authorities arrested Craig in March 2016, and he was held under their jurisdiction. In 2018, after direction from then Defense Secretary James Mattis, the U.S. Navy assumed primary jurisdiction over the case under the Status of Forces Agreement. A general court-martial began in April 2022, and on April 30th, a Navy jury convicted Craig of premeditated murder, assault consummated by a battery, and conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. On June 27, 2022, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole and dismissed from the Navy. Craig's defense maintained that Johanna had mental health struggles and may have taken her own life, pointing to traces of drugs in her system, but prosecutors presented the drugging, the eyewitness accounts, and Becker's actions after Johanna's death as evidence of premeditation. The case did not end with sentencing. In November 2023, Craig was granted more time by the Navy Marine Corps Court of Criminal Appeals to file an extended brief, continuing to challenge his conviction. Christopher R. Olson. Christopher Olson, a U.S. Navy lieutenant commander stationed in Sasebo, Japan, checked into a hotel in Fukuoka with his wife Jessica R. Guinzoni Olson on October 25, 2024. Surveillance footage later showed him leaving the hotel alone 2 days later, and a hotel staff discovered Jessica's body in the room. She had suffered blunt force injuries and signs of strangulation, with fractures to her jaw and hyoid bones. Initially, Olson was interviewed but not arrested. Months later, in May 2025, the Navy formally charged him with unpremeditated murder and obstruction of justice, but the obstruction charge was later dismissed as part of a plea agreement. At a court-martial held in San Diego on September 10, 2025, Olson pleaded guilty to murdering his wife. He admitted to being blackout drunk and recalled only fragments of the night, including feelings of anger. In exchange for his plea, he was dismissed from the Navy, ordered to forfeit all pay and allowances, and required to pay restitution of $10,654 to Jessica's family to cover funeral expenses. On September 15, 2025, the military court sentenced Olson to 23 years of confinement. Jessica's family expressed deep frustration with the plea deal, saying it fell short of the full accountability they sought for her violent death. Nildelis Arline Flores Roman. On March 16, 2024, Norfolk police were called to the 1700 block of East Little Creek Road for a report of a shooting. When officers arrived, they found 28-year-old Katrina Ann Anderson suffering from gunshot wounds, and she was unfortunately pronounced dead at the scene. Officers arrested Nildelis Flores Roman, an active-duty sailor assigned to the U.S. ship Mahan, and charged her with second-degree murder and use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. Evidence presented at trial showed that Flores Roman, her wife, Anderson, and others had returned to Flores Roman's apartment after a night out, celebrating Anderson's birthday. Flores Roman and her wife began arguing in the parking lot, and when she pulled at her wife's arm, Anderson attempted to intervene. Flores Roman and Anderson began to fight, and afterward everyone went inside the apartment. Once inside, Flores Roman retrieved a handgun from the bedroom, and her wife told Anderson to run. As Anderson tried to flee toward the front door, Flores Roman shot her twice, once in the back and once in the chest. Anderson collapsed on the sidewalk outside the apartment. Then Flores Roman struck her on the head with the firearm, which the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office described as an attempt to ensure her death. On June 17, 2025, after a 2-day trial before Judge Everett A. Martin, Jr., Flores Roman was found guilty of second-degree murder and guilty of use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. Her sentencing is scheduled for October 17, 2025. LaQuay Caldwell. In February 2012, a Navy court in Yokosuka, Japan, heard a case that shocked the military community. Seaman LaQuay Caldwell, a young sailor stationed there, admitted to taking the life of his own 5-month-old daughter. Caldwell had enlisted with the promise of building a stable life, but beneath that uniform, his personal world unraveled into violence. The victim, a defenseless infant, was found to have suffered injuries at the hands of the man sworn to protect her. Investigators quickly zeroed in on Caldwell, and his arrest came after the disturbing evidence pointed directly to him. The courtroom revealed the full weight of his actions, and faced with charges of murder, Caldwell entered a guilty plea, acknowledging responsibility for his daughter's death. In February 2012, the panel handed down its judgment, and he was sentenced to life in prison. If you enjoyed this and want to see more interesting videos, I'm going to be posting every day on this channel. I would really appreciate it if you like and subscribe. Thank you very much.